May 8, 1945. The guns have finally fallen silent across Europe. In a muddy field outside Berlin, rows of Opel Blitz trucks stretch toward the horizon, their faded Wehrmacht grey paint peeling, their engines cold. Some still bear the scars of Allied strafing runs, bullet holes puncturing their canvas covers. Others sit abandoned mid-convoy, their drivers having simply walked away when the surrender order came through. These workhorses of the German war machine had carried soldiers to the front, ammunition to the guns, and supplies across frozen Russian steppes and scorching North African deserts. Over 130,000 of these 3-ton trucks were produced during the war years, making them the most common vehicle in Hitler's armed forces. But now, in the chaos of collapse, approximately 15,000 of them sit scattered across a shattered continent, some in working condition, most damaged, all suddenly without purpose or ownership. The Allied forces are advancing through Germany, cataloguing everything they find. Soviet soldiers are already loading trucks onto trains heading east. American GIs are spray painting USARMY over German markings. In the confusion, some vehicles simply vanish into the countryside, hidden by farmers or driven away by desperate refugees. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to these 15,000 Opel Blitz trucks after the guns fell silent? The Opel Blitz wasn't just another military truck, it was the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics. Produced at the Opel plant in Brandenburg from 1930 onwards, the military variant became standard issue in 1937. The name Blitz meant lightning, and these trucks were designed for speed and reliability on Europe's roads. The most common wartime variant was the Opel Blitz 3.6 to 36 S, could carry 3 tons of cargo powered by a 3.6-litre, 6-cylinder engine producing 68 horsepower. Simple, rugged, and relatively easy to maintain, these trucks could operate in temperatures from -40 degrees Celsius on the Eastern Front to +50 degrees in North Africa. They transported everything: infantry squads, medical supplies, ammunition crates, field kitchens, communication equipment, and fuel drums. Some variants were modified as ambulances, radio trucks, or mobile workshops. By 1944, the Opel Blitz made up nearly 70% of the Wehrmacht's standard transport fleet. When the war ended, these vehicles represented not just military hardware, but potential tools for rebuilding a devastated continent. Their fate would be decided by politics, pragmatism, and the desperate needs of a world emerging from total war. Picture the scene in early May 1945. As the Reich collapsed, Wehrmacht units received contradictory orders, some to destroy all equipment, others to surrender intact. Across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories, the response varied wildly. In some locations, systematic German demolition teams worked through the night, draining fuel tanks, smashing engine blocks with sledgehammers, and setting entire motor pools ablaze. The acrid smell of burning rubber and melting paint filled the air as columns of black smoke rose above destroyed vehicle parks. In other places, chaos prevented any organized destruction. Soldiers abandoned their posts before demolition orders could be carried out. Officers fled westward, hoping to surrender to Americans or British rather than Soviets. In these moments of confusion, the Opel Blitz trucks became prizes in a continent-wide scramble. Local civilians, seeing opportunity in the disorder, approached cautiously at first, then more boldly. A farmer in Bavaria might find 3 trucks parked at the edge of his field, keys still in the ignition, half a tank of fuel remaining. He would make a decision that thousands of others were making simultaneously across Europe: take the vehicle, hide it, and say nothing. The immediate aftermath saw different fates depending on geography. In the western zones, territory controlled by American, British, and French forces, military police units conducted systematic inventories of captured equipment. Teams of Allied soldiers moved through former Wehrmacht depots, airfields, and supply dumps, cataloguing everything from pistols to panzers. The Opel Blitz trucks were valuable finds. Many were in working condition despite years of hard use. American forces needed transport vehicles immediately for occupation duties, and these German trucks fit the bill perfectly. Within weeks of the surrender, you could see Opel Blitz trucks repainted in olive drab, sporting white American stars on their doors, carrying US Army supplies through the ruins of German cities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same vehicles that had supported Hitler's conquest of Europe now served the occupiers. British forces did the same, repainting captured trucks and pressing them into service. The British particularly valued the Opel Blitz for its fuel efficiency compared to their own heavier lorries. French forces, desperate for any functioning vehicles after years of occupation, grabbed every truck they could find. But the Soviet zone told a different story. In the east, where the Red Army had fought the bloodiest campaigns of the war, the approach was more brutal and comprehensive. Soviet policy toward captured German equipment followed a simple logic. Anything useful goes back to Russia, anything else gets destroyed. Special NKVD units accompanied the advancing Red Army with a specific mission: secure all industrial equipment, vehicles, and machinery for transport to the Soviet Union. Imagine standing at a railroad siding in Saxony in June 1945. Soviet soldiers are loading dozens of Opel Blitz trucks onto flatbed rail cars. They work with practiced efficiency, driving each truck up wooden ramps, chaining them down, then moving to the next. These convoys stretch for kilometers, moving east, day and night. Entire German motor pools were systematically stripped and shipped to the Soviet Union as war reparations. The Soviets weren't interested in repainting these trucks for their own use. They had their own ZIS and GAZ models. Instead, the captured Opel Blitz trucks went to collective farms, construction brigades, and factories across Soviet territory. In the agricultural regions of Ukraine and southern Russia, these German trucks became workhorses of post-war reconstruction. Soviet mechanics stripped off military fittings, removed weapon mounts, and converted them for civilian use. A truck that once carried Wehrmacht infantry through France now hauled grain on a collective farm outside Kiev. The transformation was complete: new paint, Cyrillic lettering on the doors, Soviet red stars replacing German crosses. By 1946, hundreds of former Wehrmacht Opel Blitz trucks were operating throughout the Western Soviet Union, their German origins increasingly forgotten. The scale of Soviet appropriation was staggering. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 4,000 Opel Blitz trucks were transported to the Soviet Union in the first year after the war. Many lasted only a few years before breaking down. Spare parts were impossible to find, and Soviet mechanics often improvised repairs with whatever components they had available, but some survived surprisingly long. In the 1960s, researchers documented former German military trucks still operating in remote Soviet regions, 2 decades after the war ended. Meanwhile, across occupied Germany, a massive destruction program was underway. The Allies had agreed that Germany must never again pose a military threat. This meant not just disbanding the Wehrmacht, but physically destroying its capacity to wage war. Allied Control Council directives ordered the demolition of military equipment deemed excessive for peacetime police forces. This included thousands of captured vehicles. Walk through a designated destruction site near Hamburg in late 1945. Mountains of military equipment await processing. Opel Blitz trucks are lined up in rows, sometimes 50 or more, in a single site. Allied demolition teams methodically destroy each one. They drain the fluids, remove the engines, then use cutting torches to slice through the chassis frames. The trucks are rendered completely unusable, not just disabled, but physically cut apart to prevent any possibility of repair or reuse. The twisted metal is then loaded onto rail cars and shipped to smelters, where it's melted down for scrap. This wasn't done quietly or quickly. The destruction of military equipment was a public affair, often photographed for newsreels to show the Allied populations back home that German militarism was being permanently eliminated. Film footage from 1946 shows acres of destroyed vehicles, trucks crushed into compact cubes by industrial presses, engine blocks split open by hydraulic shears, wheels and axles piled into massive heaps awaiting the furnace. But the official destruction program faced an unexpected problem. Germany desperately needed trucks for reconstruction. The country's infrastructure was shattered. Roads needed repair. Rubble needed hauling. Food and coal needed distribution. German civilians were on the edge of starvation in the winter of 1945 to 46. The irony was cruel. Thousands of perfectly functional trucks were being destroyed, while German reconstruction efforts were crippled by lack of transport. Allied military governments eventually recognized this contradiction and modified their policies. Starting in 1946, a selection process began. Trucks in the best condition were set aside for civilian use, but only after complete demilitarization. This meant removing everything that marked them as military vehicles: machine gun mounts, armor plating, military radio equipment, camouflage paint, and all Wehrmacht markings. The trucks were then repainted in civilian colors and distributed to German businesses, municipal authorities, and reconstruction agencies. A construction company in Frankfurt might receive 3 former Wehrmacht Opel Blitz trucks to haul building materials through the ruined city. A coal merchant in the Ruhr Valley would get 2 trucks to deliver fuel to homes. These vehicles became vital tools in Germany's reconstruction, but their history was deliberately obscured. Few Germans wanted to be reminded of the war that had destroyed their country. The trucks were simply tools now, their past irrelevant. This civilian conversion program accounted for perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 of the surviving Opel Blitz trucks. Many of these vehicles remained in service well into the 1950s. German mechanics, skilled and resourceful after years of wartime improvisation, kept them running with salvaged parts and creative repairs. You could still see these trucks on German roads in 1955, now painted blue or green or red, their wartime service a fading memory. But what about the trucks that simply disappeared? In the chaos of 1945, perhaps as many as 1,500 to 2,000 Opel Blitz trucks vanished without official record. Some were driven away by German soldiers trying to get home, abandoned when the fuel ran out, and left to rust in forests or fields. Others were hidden by civilians who anticipated future use. In rural Bavaria, farmers pulled trucks into barns and covered them with hay, hoping to keep them from Allied confiscation teams. These hidden trucks tell fascinating stories. In 1987, construction workers demolishing an old warehouse in East Germany discovered 3 Opel Blitz trucks that had been walled up in 1945. They were in remarkable condition, protected from weather, their tires still inflated, Wehrmacht markings still visible under decades of dust. Someone had carefully hidden them, perhaps planning to retrieve them after the occupation ended, but never returned. The trucks were eventually acquired by military vehicle collectors. Another discovery occurred in 1993 in a remote valley in Austria. A forest ranger investigating an old logging road found 2 Opel Blitz trucks that had been driven off the road and deliberately concealed under branches and debris 50 years earlier. Trees had grown around them, nearly swallowing the vehicles. One truck still contained Wehrmacht medical supplies in its cargo bed, bandages, surgical instruments, and bottles of medicine, all perfectly preserved in sealed containers. These discoveries continue even today. In 2008, a farmer in Poland draining a pond on his property found an Opel Blitz truck submerged in the mud. Investigation suggested it had been driven into the water deliberately in May 1945, possibly by retreating German soldiers who preferred to destroy it rather than let it fall into Soviet hands. The truck was eventually recovered and restored by a Polish military museum. The strangest fate befell those trucks that ended up in completely unexpected places. After the war, various nations received German military equipment as war reparations or aid. Norway received several dozen Opel Blitz trucks to help rebuild its infrastructure after 5 years of occupation. These trucks served Norwegian municipalities throughout the 1950s, painted in municipal colors, their German origins gradually forgotten by the communities they served. In the Middle East, a different story unfolded. As tensions rose between Arabs and Jews in Palestine before Israeli independence in 1948, both sides scrambled for military equipment. Former Wehrmacht vehicles, including Opel Blitz trucks, were smuggled into the region through various channels. Jewish forces acquired some through purchases from surplus dealers in Europe. Arab forces obtained others through different networks. When war broke out in 1948, Opel Blitz trucks that had once served Hitler's armies were now facing each other across the battlefields of Palestine, serving completely opposite sides in a new conflict. The Israeli Defense Forces continued using captured and acquired Opel Blitz trucks well into the 1950s. These vehicles proved valuable in Israel's early years when any functional transport was precious. Israeli mechanics became expert at maintaining them with improvised parts. Some of these trucks saw service in multiple Middle Eastern conflicts, an extraordinary journey from Wehrmacht service in Europe to Israeli service in the Negev Desert. France presents another intriguing chapter. The French army, desperate for vehicles after liberation, incorporated captured German trucks into its forces. When France became involved in the Indochina War in the late 1940s, some of these vehicles were shipped to Southeast Asia. Former Wehrmacht Opel Blitz trucks ended up serving French colonial forces in Vietnam, transported thousands of kilometers from where they were originally deployed. Some were captured by Viet Minh forces and used against the French. The same trucks that had rolled through France in 1940 as conquerors were now fighting in Vietnamese jungles a decade later. Yugoslavia under Tito received substantial quantities of captured German equipment as the country rebuilt after devastating partisan warfare. Opel Blitz trucks became part of the Yugoslav People's Army vehicle fleet. They served throughout the 1950s, repainted and maintained by Yugoslav mechanics. Some were eventually sold to civilian enterprises when they were finally retired from military service in the early 1960s. The rarest survivors are those that made it into museums and private collections. Today, approximately 30 to 40 authenticated wartime Opel Blitz military trucks exist in restorable or restored condition worldwide. This represents less than 0.03% of wartime production, a survival rate that makes them significantly rarer than many tank types. Museums in Germany, the United States, Britain, France, and Russia display examples, each truck telling its own story of survival. The most complete example resides at the German Tank Museum in Münster. This particular truck was captured by American forces in April 1945, used by the US Army for 2 years, then given to a German construction company in 1947. It served as a civilian truck until 1962 when it was retired and stored in a barn. In 1989, military vehicle enthusiasts discovered it and spent 5 years restoring it to its 1945 configuration, complete with authentic Wehrmacht markings and period-correct equipment. Private collectors have driven up the value of surviving Opel Blitz trucks dramatically. A truck in poor condition might sell for $15,000 to $20,000, while a fully restored example can command $50,000 to $80,000 or more. Collectors prize these vehicles not because they were sophisticated or particularly rare during the war, but precisely because they were so common. They represent the typical German military experience more authentically than any Tiger tank or exotic weapon system. The restoration community has developed remarkable expertise in maintaining these trucks. Since original parts are nearly impossible to find, specialists have learned to fabricate components or adapt parts from other vehicles. Engine rebuilds present particular challenges as the 3.6-litre Opel engines were specific to these trucks, and no new parts have been manufactured since the 1940s. Resourceful mechanics scout industrial machinery from the same era, looking for similar components that can be adapted. Some of the most poignant survivors are trucks that remained in continuous civilian use for decades, their wartime service unknown to most who saw them. A particular example in southern Germany served as a farm truck from 1946 until 1978, over 30 years of continuous use. The farmer who operated it had acquired it through official Allied demilitarization channels, never knowing its specific wartime history. When he finally retired it, and a collector examined it closely, they found evidence suggesting it had served on the Eastern Front, repair patches typical of cold weather damage, Cyrillic graffiti scratched on interior panels by Soviet soldiers who had briefly captured it before it was recaptured by German forces. The environmental toll of these vehicles should not be overlooked. Thousands of Opel Blitz trucks were simply abandoned where they stopped running, in fields, forests, along roadsides, in ditches. Over the decades they slowly disintegrated, leaking oil, fuel, and other fluids into the soil. In some former battlefield areas in Eastern Europe, the environmental legacy of abandoned vehicles from all sides of the conflict remains a concern even today. Clean-up operations occasionally uncover rusted truck frames still buried in overgrown forests. The scrap metal from destroyed Opel Blitz trucks had an afterlife of its own. German steel was in high demand for reconstruction. The metal from thousands of demolished military vehicles was melted down and reformed into building materials, machinery, and new vehicles for peacetime use. In a very real sense, the substance of Hitler's war machine was literally reshaped into tools of peace and reconstruction. A truck that carried ammunition to the front in 1944 might have become part of a steel beam in a school building by 1948, or a component in a civilian automobile by 1950. But the human stories connected to these trucks add another dimension to their fate. Veterans who served as Wehrmacht drivers sometimes encountered their old vehicles in unexpected circumstances after the war. One documented case involved a former German army driver who, while working as a civilian truck driver in 1952, realized he was driving the exact same Opel Blitz he had operated during the war. He recognized specific damage marks and a unique repair weld he had made himself in 1943. The vehicle had been captured, repainted, demilitarized, and eventually sold to his civilian employer. He drove it for another 3 years before it was finally scrapped. For many German veterans, seeing these trucks in Allied service or in civilian use triggered complex emotions. These vehicles represented their youth, their service, and often the traumatic experiences of war. Some veterans refused to have anything to do with them after the war, while others sought them out specifically, finding comfort in working with familiar machinery, even if it now served different masters. The Soviet attitude toward captured German vehicles evolved over time. Initially valued as war reparations and useful equipment, by the 1950s they were seen as outdated relics. The Soviet Union had developed its own automotive industry and no longer needed German trucks. Many were simply driven until they failed, then abandoned. Rural areas across the Western Soviet republics had small graveyards of rusting German vehicles throughout the 1950s and 1960s, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The Cold War complicated the legacy of these trucks in another way. In West Germany, the post-war Bundeswehr needed vehicles, but anything associated with the Wehrmacht was politically sensitive. West Germany's new army deliberately chose new equipment to distance itself from the Nazi past. Any surviving Opel Blitz trucks in West German hands were rapidly phased out of official use. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, had fewer qualms about using captured Wehrmacht vehicles in its early years, though by the 1950s these too were replaced with Soviet-designed vehicles. The Opel plant in Brandenburg itself became a symbol of Cold War division. The facility was in the Soviet zone and was eventually absorbed into the East German industrial system. The plant that had produced tens of thousands of Wehrmacht trucks was retooled to produce vehicles for the Eastern Bloc. The connection to the wartime Blitz production was deliberately downplayed in official East German history. Modern archaeology continues to uncover evidence of these trucks' final moments. Battlefield archaeologists working in former Eastern Front combat zones occasionally find remains of destroyed vehicles. One particularly moving discovery in Belarus in 2011 involved an Opel Blitz that had been hit by Soviet anti-tank fire in 1944. The truck had burned completely, and investigation of the wreckage revealed the remains of 7 Wehrmacht soldiers who had died in the attack. They were buried with military honors, and the truck wreckage was preserved as a memorial at the site. The digital age has brought renewed interest in these vehicles. Online communities of military vehicle enthusiasts share photographs, documentation, and restoration advice. Researchers have compiled databases attempting to track individual vehicles through serial numbers, unit markings, and photographic evidence. This work has revealed surprising patterns. Trucks that served in North Africa ending up in Norway, trucks from the Eastern Front finishing their days on Israeli farms, individual vehicles with service histories spanning 3 continents and multiple conflicts. The question of how many Opel Blitz trucks survive today in any form, even as rusted hulks, is impossible to answer precisely. Estimates suggest perhaps 200 to 300 exist worldwide, in various conditions from fully restored museum pieces to rusted frames in fields awaiting discovery. Each one represents a fraction of a % of the original production, making them witnesses to one of history's most catastrophic periods. The fate of these 15,000 trucks mirrors the fate of Germany itself in the years after 1945, divided, repurposed, scattered across the globe, their original purpose destroyed, their substance transformed into something new. Some were obliterated in the systematic destruction of German military power. Others served new masters, repainted and reformed. A few survived through luck, hidden away or simply forgotten. And the rarest few remained intact, preserved by chance or intention, to serve as tangible links to a past that reshaped the world. When you see one of these trucks today, in a museum or at a military vehicle show, you're looking at an extraordinary survivor. This particular vehicle navigated not just the chaos of war, but the equally dangerous chaos of peace, the systematic destruction programs, the repurposing efforts, the decades of hard use, the environmental decay, the simple passage of time. Each scratch in the paint, each repair weld, each modified component tells part of a story that spans continents and decades. The Opel Blitz trucks were never glamorous weapons. They didn't have the fearsome reputation of German tanks or the mythic status of fighter aircraft. They were simply workhorses, performing the unglamorous but essential task of keeping armies supplied and mobile. Their fate after the war reflected that utilitarian nature. They were used, repurposed, scrapped, and forgotten by all but a few specialists and enthusiasts. Yet their story reveals truths about war's aftermath that more famous weapons cannot tell. These trucks carried soldiers to battles they would not survive, transported ammunition that would kill thousands, and supported a regime that brought catastrophe to Europe and the world. After that regime collapsed, the same vehicles became tools of reconstruction, recovery, and renewal. The metal and machinery held no inherent ideology. It was simply put to whatever use the current owners required. In this transformation lies a kind of redemption, not of the Reich they served, but of the principle that even instruments of war can be remade into instruments of peace. Stand in a field in Brandenburg today, near where the Opel plant once hummed with wartime production. The factory is gone, the workers are dead, the Reich is ashes, but somewhere in that field, buried under decades of soil and vegetation, there might be remnants of a truck that rolled off that assembly line 80 years ago. Its journey from that factory to its final resting place contains a history more complex and far-reaching than its designers could have imagined, a history of conquest and defeat, destruction and survival, the end of one world and the difficult birth of another.